Okay.
This is our third in a series of programs. And today we'd like to deal with precognitive information, and specifically we'll use the L10-11 plane crash back in 1985 to help people to understand the psychological and spiritual aspects of coping with precognition.
Interesting. Can I listen? Dr. Kenneth Ring at the University of Connecticut, through many questionnaires and many hours of private type conversations, asked me many questions, most of which I was unfamiliar with. In other words, had I ever heard of a precognition? Well, certainly I had, but I never delved into it at all. And then eventually when he questioned me on, Tom, could you give us an example of a retrocognition, a precognition, and possibly something clairvoyant, my immediate reaction was laughter. And I used the word stupid. I really meant ignorant, but I said the word stupid, and I said, gee, Ken, don't you realize how stupid that is? And what I was really thinking of was that these researchers were very ignorant, because they, in fact, obviously knew nothing at all about clairvoyance, retrocognitions, and precognitions, because my immediate reaction was, well, Ken, there's no such thing as a precognition and a retrocognition. There are only different functions of clairvoyance. And I said, if you have a precognition of a very detailed event or subject or something like that, you are only functioning clairvoyantly, and you have picked clairvoyantly something that is, as we perceive time, ahead of time, or future. The same with retrocognitively. Past life regression oftentimes are retrocognitive, as opposed to zeroing in on your personalized past life. They are retrocognitive, and you are functioning clairvoyantly, and you are pulling out many personalized and spiritual details of another life. So sometimes we have to be careful of those things. At any rate,
a life that was not your own.
Yeah, in other words, may or may not be your own. So the caution there is you have to really delve into what is it that you are functioning at, say in a past life regression. Were you regressing to your personalized past life, or were you regressing to a clairvoyant state that allowed you to go to another person's life at another time? And it's curious to see that we usually, by power of suggestion, go backwards in time. It would be more curious to see the result of the same people, same practitioners, the same recipients to do that and purposely decide to go ahead of time, to see if they would be as receptive as I'm saying that they are clairvoyantly forward or future in time. In other words, to either their future life or just future events. Well, as you said, we'll use the example of a plane crash. There's several things that I want to say as we start this, and that I need to be chastised, because in this whole event, I made some very, very remarkable mistakes, mostly on a personal level. First of all, having had this precognition of a tragic nature, of a plane crash, involving my favorite passenger airplane, which I often champion, also becoming extremely personally involved with the information that came one night while being interviewed at the University of Connecticut. And by personally involved, I mean way overly involved on a personal level, on a semi-spiritual level. And I don't know if I'll delve into that too much, but very bluntly, I really took on more than what I should have. I'm being judgmental about myself, saying that now humanistically, as well as psychically, as well as spiritually. In other words, I pushed things to the limit. I demanded of myself that which I really shouldn't have delved into. In other words, the extent or the extreme. I didn't really do anything bad or wrong. In other words, I shouldn't be put in jail. But as a result of the little bit of greed that I demanded of myself, in other words, I became a little too greedy at times, a little too demanding, and so on. I reaped the harvest of what I sowed. And
caused yourself the pain.
Well, very much so. A lot of pain, a lot of disruption, a lot of heartache, as well as a lot of, how can I describe it? Intellectual responsibility, spiritually speaking. I'll get into that later, but I wanted to summarize kind of what we'll try to cover here.
You were aware of that about a year and 7 months before the actual crash?
Yeah. I don't recall the exact day, but it was in middle of October of 1983. And as typical, if you've seen any of my tapes or talked to me, be careful quoting me on exact dates. But as best I can recall, it was October of 83, and that we now know that the event took place in the summer of 85.
August 2nd of 85.
Right, August 2nd. Because I'm still not sure of the exact dates when it was so important as to zeroing in as best I could the timing of the event, which was only, it was to the tune of 2 weeks prior to the event. I tried very hard to come up with a date. I wasn't able to come up with either the number, in other words, the Monday, Tuesday, or the number day. But I just, as best I could regarding that season, I said something to the effect that it will have had happen sometime between the 1st of, the 1st of July, and it will have had taken place before my birthday. But then I corrected that and I said, in fact, thinking of that framework in time, that it will happen exactly halfway between that time, never realizing that meant it had to happen within 72 hours. It was in a very short period of time, or certainly that week. And I wasn't aware of that for the next couple of days. The people in the room were aware of that, and being as polite as they were, they didn't say something like, but Tom, that means within the next couple of days. I'm sure that they did that on purpose, knowing that would have upset me tremendously. So, thank them for that. At any rate, back in October, a year and a half prior, the scene basically was one of my roundtable discussions, again, a 72-hour dialogue, where I would just arrive at the University of Connecticut at the famous near-death hotel, and whoever would show up or whoever would be there, either sometimes I would be invited because somebody would be there, or I would be there, and then people would just come in knowing that I was there and would be able to ask questions about my near-death experience and other related subjects. So the day before, and it was the daylight hours, I was introduced to a couple of scientists and physicists, and we chatted about related subjects. And then as the night hours came, as it went in after the typical lasagna dinner that, in other words, if you've ever been in the near-death hotel, you only have lasagna because it's the only thing that you can divide into 100 pieces or 3 pieces. And it was the dish of the near-death hotel. Read Heading Toward Omega if you don't know what the near-death hotel is, or borrow the book and read just the first couple of chapters. At any rate, in the near-death hotel, we were talking, and as Ken Ring said of me, just ask Tom a question, he'll get on a roll, and it'll happen. And what he meant by that is, you might have to suggest the subject matter, and then I'll just take off with my big mouth and talk with many details about it. So as it turned out, I just happened to be talking about the life and times of Jesus Christ in much more detail than I would have ever expected that I would have in 1983. So I was on a roll, and I was very comfortable and enjoying myself, and the people that were taping and listening to me were enjoying the evening. Now, it's also typical in those conversations that there'll be side conversations. In other words, 2 or 3 people will hear what they'll ask me a question and hear what they wanted to hear from me, and then they'll discuss among themselves implications, or that will lead to another subject. And so there just happened to the right of where I was sitting 4 women, one of whom was Norma Krenzel, the mistress of the near-death hotel and the international hugger of the world, a title that I still give to her. One of the first strangers that I ever hugged in my life at 33 years old. So, I mean, she's important, for that. She has that title and so on. And I've always been very comfortable being in her company and so on. She's one of those few people that you can talk to and not feel as though you have to pretend or put on ears or protect her ears. Or so she and 3 other women were talking about a movie and or a book. And one of the titles, as best I can recall, that most people are familiar with, is The Ghost of Flight 401. Now, that's basically the way I understand it. I haven't read the book, of course. Haven't read it, but it's about the ghostly apparitions of the pilot of a plane that crashed in the Everglades. I don't recall what year, but say 4 or 5 years ago, or a few years before.
Before 1983.
Yeah. Oh, we're up. We're almost the turn of the century now. Okay. As a matter of fact, what is today's date? So we should say it.
Today is the 24th of
October of 89. Okay. I know where we are. All right. So we're talking about something that's at least 4 years ago. And then we're jumping to 5.5 years ago when this came to my mind as a precognition. Well, they were talking about this book or the movie, and I wasn't listening to them at all. I mean, I wasn't eavesdropping. But it is typical of me, even though I'm talking very intently and very rapidly about a certain subject, if you, within my hearing range, say a non-truth, I call it a lie. But if you make a mistake, for instance, I might still call it a lie, and I mean it lovingly, that's intolerable to me. And if I know any information to correct you, I'll stop talking and interrupt you and correct you. No, it's done with love. It's not done as, hey, you can't lie in front of me. I mean, there's no arrogance involved. It's just that that's happened many times. And I don't know if it is a characteristic of mine or if it's just that I'm so, the actual truth is so important to me that fine details are very important, and that you should strive very much for the absolute truth as opposed to an assumption or something like that. Well, they were discussing the ending of the book or the ending of the movie, where the last apparition of that, the ghostly apparition of the pilot of the plane that crashed in the Everglades, made the statement to one of the airline stewardesses that there will never be another crash of an L10-11. And see, I said it without
You said it very well.
becoming emotional. That was the statement. In other words, again, the statement was, there will never be another crash of an L10-11, period. Well, as that was experienced originally, the misconception by the general population was that there will never be another crash of that type of plane. But my understanding, rather instantly by hearing them at that point say that, and why it was wrong, was that, first of all, they didn't understand what the ghostly apparition meant by that. Now, the pilot in the book and in the movie, the Flight 401, what he meant was, in his time, there will never be a crash of one of his planes. He's personally involved, he's spiritually involved, he's on the other side, he's dead, but he's earthbound, if you will, I'll use that phrase. And in his time, while he's in this condition, he will do whatever's necessary to assist and protect his airplanes, meaning Lockheed L10-11 TriStars. In his time, he was also earthbound. Now, this is a judgmental statement on my part. I don't know if there's been any writing or anything about this, but I'm telling you this from information that I have. That he was earthbound by an uncontrolled desire to be rectified in the responsibility of the plane crash. He was the pilot. Right away, the investigation pointed to the finger that he was not at his post at the controls when the plane crashed, that he was in the underside, the belly of the plane. And it took a very long time for the investigators to prove all the circumstances that he did not do something wrong to create that plane crash, that it was an actual accident, that the plane and the pilot and the co-pilot were all victims of circumstances that were very strange and unique, if you will, and that they did follow proper procedure, but there were some mistakes made inadvertently. In other words, it wasn't, they couldn't blame them, couldn't find fault with them. So in that time frame, which I don't recall, but I'm sure that it was more than a year, there were many events where the ghostly apparition appeared to stewardesses on the planes where there were parts from that crash plane recycled or reused. And one event, just to give you an idea so this isn't too confusing, was that the ghostly apparition, the pilot, appeared to one of the stewardesses and announced that go to the pilot of the plane that is flying and tell him to land at the nearest airport, that there is going to be a fire. But if he lands at the nearest airport right now, there will be no problem, no loss of life, and the plane will be okay, and so on. If this is ignored, then there will be a problem with the plane. Conceivably, the plane could catch on fire and crash. So the stewardess went rather fanatical because she'd never seen a ghost before. So instead of really listening to what she had to say and the information that there will be a fire aboard this plane, and that if you're on a runway or at an airport, it can be just taken care of normally, she got so frantic that they decided that they should land the plane at the nearest airport to get her off the plane. That was for her protection and the well-being of the passengers. So they landed the plane. This is documented in history. You can look it up however you're able to look something like that up. And the plane landed, and while they were getting her off the plane and giving her a barbiturate or something, or calming her down, the radar element in the very nose of the plane burst into flame. Well, to have something like that happen, what it does, it just creates a little bit of smoke. So naturally, alarms would go off and so on. Now, if it was in flight, conceivably, that would continue to burn, and it would catch the plane on fire and create a disaster, conceivably a disaster. But being on the runway, they simply open the nose of the plane, take the element out, blow a little of the smoke out of the way, put a new element in it, close it up, check it out, and it's okay to fly. So the flight, other than the interruption of landing, didn't have to be postponed, or I don't even believe that the passengers had to be taken off the plane. So the plane was saved, if you will, by the information from the ghost. All right, that set the scene. Now, the statement that they said was, there will never be another crash in an L10-11. Well, in the middle of my conversation, I just stopped right away and turned right toward them, and I said with a great deal of emotion, but that's not true. And then blurting that out loud, I realized what I'd said out loud. In other words, this was subconscious or just spontaneous. Right away in my mind, I realized in order for me to say that, I have to know that there will be another crash in an L10-11. And of course, that just shut my throat right off like that, and I put my head down and started to cry. The emotions involved in that, in other words, the sensationalism of it, I didn't like. I mean, to say, just do that. I didn't even like the idea of doing that. And I wish I could have just said, oh, never mind. Yeah. But of course, I said that much, and they were now silent and just looking at me.
Everybody was waiting for more to be said.
And of course, Dr. Kenneth Ring, in his psychology voice, the psychologist that he is, he lowers his voice and gets more intelligent-like. And he says, well, Tom, obviously what you've said is... And so I just looked at him and I said, Ken, knock off the psychology talk. This is just me. But I then got up from the table and I walked out onto a balcony and collected myself for a few minutes. And I came back, and then Ken very lovingly, carefully hinted, Tom, is there anything that you would wish to add to what you said? And then he did say, I would like to ask a couple of questions. And the two questions were the flip side of, well, for you to say that, isn't it obvious that you're actually saying that you know of the probability of that type of plane crashing, or is it in fact that you are aware of? And of course, again, my emotions swelled, but I just sat there and waited long enough. And inside me, I mean, my heart was pounding, and I mean, I wanted to tell everybody everything. And at the same time, this is all crazy, so I can't say anything. In other words, psychologically, emotionally in me. At the same time, I was dealing in my mind with cause and effect relationships. Is this right for me to be talking about? In other words, not just emotionally and psychologically, but spiritually. I have a lot of information that at most times I can't just blurt out and share with people. And I mean, you're aware of that, and many of the people that have talked to me before have to be aware of that. So I was dealing with that, and it took several minutes. I did state many things. I'll try to recall the way I said it too. Because I said, well, there will be, and I had to cover my face up, and I just cried and I said there will be, because also remember, this is my favorite airplane, and this is hurting my feelings to be suddenly aware of that my favorite airplane is going to have another crash. And so, again, time delay and some emotions. And then I said, but some of it is so confusing to me. And then I swore. I used to swear a lot in those days. I swore, and I was damning myself because, among other things, I was saying, why do I have to know this? I know so much, meaning about the details of the crash. I know so much, but yet I'm contradicting myself. And see, I haven't even given the details, but I'm dealing with it. And I'm saying these half sentences out loud. I blurted out several things, and I don't have them in the right order necessarily, but one of them was, how can I be knowing this? And what I meant was, how can I be seeing this perfectly clear? How am I knowing this, but I can't see the white building clear? Now, I was questioning my ability that if I can see something ahead in time, then that's it. There's no question about that, and it's that. And that if I can know it, then that means I'm seeing it perfectly clear. But it's as though my vision was blurred or blocked. And why can't I identify this white building that's very important to me? In other words, it would be desirous of me to know what this white building is, where it is, and so on regarding the plane crash. And I said white building. I didn't say gas tank or metal object or white round disc or, I didn't say any of those things. I said white building. So that technically was a mistake. As far as, again, I said building, and it wasn't a building. In hindsight, it turned out to be a tank. I also said, how can I know it's 103 degrees? I said it just like that. How can I know that it's exactly 103 degrees, and yet I don't know when or where it is?
Outside.
Right. And the frustration of that was the two main questions, when and exactly where. So I'm damning myself for not knowing that, and yet I know many details. In that conversation, at that time, in that conversation, it was about 3:30 in the morning. And I looked at Ken and I said, Ken, I know all the people. That was about the worst part of it, because it's always been a frustration of mine. I like people.
Yeah.
And how can I know people so personally and privately and intimately and be able to deal with them that 90% of them will die? Now, their death doesn't bother me, but why do I have to know it?
Right.
See, because philosophically, it's okay to die. You have permission to die in a natural way, or in a tragedy or something like that, other than suicide. No, it's really okay to die. I'm eagerly anticipating my own death. There's even, kind of chaotically, a little bit of jealousy. When I know of people dying, I have a certain feeling of loneliness.
Yeah.
Because they're moving on to where I've had a glimpse of, where I've been, and I can't be right now, and I miss that. So that loneliness, or jealousy, if you will, I was also experiencing at the same time. But Ken asked me a question, and I said, and I kind of almost sarcastically, spat back at him, and it was to qualify. I said, Ken, I can read you off their first names. And I said that like a scientist, because he asked a question about, well, how can you know them? Something like that. I don't recall the exact words. Some other details were, of course, that it was a Lockheed L10-11 TriStar. And I said, then a quick statement. I said, they're so beautiful. And do you know how many people they carry? Which, of course, swelled up the emotions again, because I was then thinking of the people. Well, there were several other statements about details. I was damning myself because I could see the airport, but the contradiction was the plane did not crash at an airport. Now that's a contradiction. So what's wrong with me that I can see the airport, I can see the runway, and I can see what it looks like from that angle, but I know that the plane crashes in a muddy field. and that it also hits this white structure, this white building that I said. And it doesn't make sense that how can I know it's at an airport, but it doesn't crash at an airport? Contradiction of terms. Also, I was then very, very frustrated, and I'm sure nobody understood me in that room that day, that how can I know all these people? And then I interrupted myself and said, and there's also a person that dies that doesn't belong. Now, I didn't say it that clearly either. I mean, I was very, very emotional. And I was very frustrated by the fact that there's somebody who dies in this event that doesn't belong. Well, I knew a lot of details about who the person was, why, in other words, all the questions that you might want to ask me right now, like who was it and where was he and so on. I was dwelling on those aspects, and then I just said, I don't understand. In other words, I wasn't understanding, why does he die in the plane crash, but he doesn't belong? So I then further qualified that, and I told Ken Ring later that night, that he wasn't on the plane, that he didn't belong. Ken Ring, I'm sure, and other people thought that I meant maybe it was a stowaway or something like that. But in fact, I was aware that he was in a car, in an automobile. He was also a mechanic. And so again, brotherly love, another
Right.
fellow mechanic, and a really nice guy. So again, I can identify with him more so than the businessman on the airplane. Prejudice and bias comes in place because I'm functioning on an emotional, the psychological level as well. So a few other details, some very important details. That sort of ended that conversation that night. We did talk about other things. We got off the subject, and I talked right through the next day. So it sort of was shelved or subsided. I met with Ken Ring privately a month or so later, and he brought the subject up. And he asked some specific detailed questions, which I answered very accurately. We did not get through any more details about the frustration of the discrepancies, such as the white building, what was that? He did ask me, Tom, if you can see the airport, is it an airport? Is it an airport that you've been to before? And I said, I know that it's not. But then I started comparing, and I said, what I'm about to say isn't right. I was very cautious about that. But I said, of the airports that I've been to, it looks mostly like in either Philadelphia or Pittsburgh. And then I wasn't sure which. I said, well, it's the one with the water alongside it. Notice there's ships there, so I think that's Philadelphia. Whichever one.
And it ended up to be Dallas?
Yeah, it ended up being Dallas. But again, with the white tanks at the ends of the runway, if
Right.
you've ever been to the one in Pennsylvania, it looks a lot like that.
Uh-huh.
Then he also said, when you also said something very specifically, and you said it several times, 103 degrees. What do you mean by that? And I said, well, it's very hot. I said, it's never that hot in Rochester, New York. And I said, also, that tells you that it has to be. Now, see, what I'm doing now is logical deductive reasoning with the initial precognition, which I caution people about because it often doesn't work. In other words, my frustration with how can I see